Mae Keene had buried her husband in the red dust of Caldwell, Kansas, on a Tuesday in April of 1882, and by Wednesday morning she had already told 3 separate people that she did not need their casseroles, their prayers, or their pity. She stood in the doorway of the little homestead on the eastern edge of town, one hand braced against the frame, and her jaw set in that particular way that the women of Caldwell had come to recognize over the past 2 years. That square, unyielding tilt that said she had made her decision, and no amount of Christian charity was going to move it. Her dark hair was pinned up with none of the careful attention she might have given it before Thomas Keene had taken a fever and decided to leave her alone in this flat, windy stretch of earth she had once called an adventure. She was 28 years old, and she had a farm to run and 7 laying hens, and a small plot of wheat that Thomas had started in the fall and never seen mature to harvest. She had 4 walls and a roof and a name that was her own, and she told herself that was enough. Ruth Hannigan had come first, bearing a pot of beef stew and an expression so full of tender concern that Mae had felt almost violent. Ruth was a soft woman, round-faced and easily moved to tears, married to the town doctor and accustomed to people needing things from her. She had said, "Oh, Mae, you simply cannot stay out here alone," and Mae had said, "Watch me," and then thanked her very politely for the stew before closing the door. Preacher Aldous Dowd had come next, holding his hat and his Bible with equal reverence, offering the services of the congregation, a team of men who could help with the farm, women who could come and keep her company through the long nights. Mae had told him that the congregation's energy might be better spent on people who wanted it, and that she slept just fine. And then Bert Holloway from the feed store had stopped her on Main Street on Wednesday afternoon and said in that loud, carrying voice he had, "You know, Mrs. Keene, there is absolutely no shame in letting folks lend a hand. You are a woman alone." And Mae had stopped walking and turned to look at him and said, loud enough that the 3 or 4 people on the boardwalk could hear every word, "I have 2 arms, 2 legs, a sharp mind, and a rifle I know how to use. I do not need anyone, Bert. Not you, not the preacher, not the ladies' circle, not one single soul in this town. Thomas Keene left me well enough to stand on my own 2 feet, and that is exactly what I intend to do." Word traveled fast in Caldwell. By Thursday, the whole town knew what Mae Keene had said. Some of them admired her for it. Most of them pitied her quietly and decided that grief did peculiar things to a person, and that she would soften in time. A small and slightly mean portion of them decided to take her at her word and not offer again, nursing a collective wounded pride that would simmer under the surface of every Sunday service and every chance meeting at the general store for months to come. Mae did not particularly care what any of them thought. She went home and she fed her hens, and she studied Thomas's planting journals by candlelight, and she told herself that loneliness was only a feeling, and feelings were not facts, and facts were what mattered out here on the Kansas plains, where the wind never stopped and the sky went on forever, and a person had to be made of something harder than sentiment to survive. Martin Granger had come to Caldwell in February of that same year, which meant he had been in town for 2 months before Mae's husband died, and 2 months more before the summer settled in like a heavy hand pressing down on the grass. He had come from Texas originally, following work north the way a lot of men did in those years after the cattle trails had changed the map of the plains entirely. He was 32 years old, broad across the shoulders in the way that came from real work rather than performance, with dark eyes set deep under a straight brow and hands that had the kind of useful roughness to them that you noticed when he passed something across a counter. He worked for Elias Wren at the Wren Ranch, which sat 4 miles northwest of town and ran about 400 head of cattle across pasture land that stretched in every direction until it blurred into the horizon. Elias Wren was a fair employer and a quiet man, and he had hired Martin on the strength of a letter from a rancher in Abilene who said Martin Granger was the most dependable man he had ever employed, and the only man he had ever met who could read cattle weather 3 days out. Martin had ridden in on a gray February morning with a single bag, a good horse he called Duster, and nothing much in the way of plans beyond the next season. He had seen Mae Keene exactly 4 times before her husband died, once at the feed store, where she had been arguing pleasantly but firmly with Bert Holloway about the price of chicken feed. Once at the Sunday service that Elias Wren insisted his men attend when they were in town, where she had sat in the second pew with her husband and sung the hymns in a clear, unsentimental voice. Once at the general store, where they had reached for the same bolt of dark cotton at the same moment and both pulled back and she had said, "Go ahead," without looking at him. And once when he had been riding the south fence of the Wren property, and she had been driving her small wagon along the road below, and she had not looked up and he had not called out, and nothing had passed between them at all, except the same dry spring wind. He had heard about Thomas Keene's death the way everyone did, through the rapid nervous system of a small town. He had heard about Mae's declaration on Main Street through Elias Wren's eldest son, Cody, who had been one of the people on the boardwalk, and who recounted the whole thing with a kind of gleeful disbelief. Martin had listened without comment and gone back to mending the stretch of fence he had been working on, and the matter had seemed closed. Summer in Caldwell in 1882 was the kind of summer that old-timers talked about for 30 years afterward. The heat came down hard in June, and it did not relent. The wind that usually cut across the plains and gave everything a grudging relief turned fitful and strange, and the clouds that built up on the horizon afternoon after afternoon never fully broke into rain. The creek that ran east of town dropped to a thin silver thread by July. Farmers watched their fields with expressions that moved between worry and a deeper, quieter desperation, and the conversations at the feed store and the saloon took on the careful, circling quality of people who were afraid to say the worst thing out loud in case the saying of it made it real. Mae's wheat struggled. She had known it would. She was an honest woman with herself about what she understood and what she did not, and farming was something Thomas had known and she had only been learning. She hauled water from the creek with a determination that left her muscles aching from her shoulders to her knees, and she bartered 3 of her laying hens for help from the Garfield boy who lived down the road, a 14-year-old named Sam who came 3 mornings a week and did what she told him and went home again without asking questions she did not want to answer. The roof had been a concern since spring. Thomas had known about it too. There was a section over the back bedroom where the boards had been damaged by a late winter storm and patched too quickly and not well enough, and Thomas had meant to fix it properly before he got sick. Mae had climbed up and looked at it herself in May and decided it would hold through summer. In the way of things that hold just barely long enough for you to think you are safe, it held through June. It held through most of July. On the night of the 22nd of July, a storm came in from the west that was not the ordinary summer lightning and bluster that rolled through the plains without delivering much. This one had been building for 3 days in a mass of dark cloud that the ranchers watched with the concentrated attention of men whose livelihoods depended on reading sky. Martin Granger had told Elias Wren on the 20th that it was going to be a bad one, and Elias had moved the cattle to the lower pasture and secured what could be secured and sent his family into the solidly built main house. The storm hit at 2 in the morning. The wind came first, the kind of wind that has a voice to it, a low sustained roar that built until it pressed against every structure in Caldwell like a living thing trying to find a way in. Then the rain, a wall of it, the kind of rain the plains saved up for weeks and then released all at once in furious apology. Lightning walked across the Kansas sky in long, branching steps. In the Keene homestead on the eastern edge of town, Mae was awake. She had been awake for an hour before the storm hit, listening to it come, and she had moved her things out of the back bedroom in a precautionary way, pulling her good quilt and her mother's small tin box of letters and the book she was reading into the front room. She had told herself it was only caution and not fear. She had fed the stove enough wood to keep the front room warm and lit the lamp, and sat in Thomas's chair with the book open on her lap, listening to the wind build and the rain begin. The crack when it came was not gradual. It was a single enormous sound, a splitting and a collapse and a rush of wet air, and then the back bedroom was open to the sky in the center of the room, where the weakened section of roof had finally given way entirely. The joists on either side of the break groaned and shifted, and Mae stood in the doorway between the front room and the back, and looked at the rain pouring in through a hole large enough to put a horse through, and thought, with the precise clarity that genuine shock sometimes brings, that this was significantly worse than she had prepared for. She looked at the rest of the roof. In the lamplight, she could see the dark stain of water spreading rapidly across the boards to either side of the break, and she could actually hear the sounds of more joists beginning to strain under the weight of soaked wood and driven rain. She went to her front door and opened it, and the wind nearly took it off its hinges. The darkness outside was absolute except for the lightning, which came in flashes that lit the landscape in a cold blue-white that showed her the road, the fence, the bent and thrashing shapes of the cottonwood trees she had planted along the south edge of the property in her first spring here. There was no one near. The Garfield place was half a mile down the road. The nearest neighbor on the east side was old widow Ames, who was 73 and deaf in one ear, and whose own house was likely faring no better in this weather. The town of Caldwell proper was 2 miles west, and in this storm and this dark, 2 miles might as well have been 20. Mae Keene stood in her doorway in her nightgown with the rain driving sideways and the wind taking her breath, and she did not cry. She did not panic, but she thought, with a cold precision that she recognized as something close to fear, that she needed help, and that she had told an entire town, loudly and publicly and with considerable conviction, that she needed no one. She went back inside. She pulled on her boots and her heaviest coat. She found the lantern and lit it, though the wind made it a difficult and profane exercise. She went to the front room and looked at the narrow space she had and thought about what could be moved and where it could be moved to. And she was in the process of dragging her trunk against the far wall, away from the spreading water, when she heard hoofbeats on the road. They were fast, purposeful hoofbeats, the kind that a rider makes when he knows where he is going and is going there with commitment. And then they stopped outside her house, and there was a heavy knock on the door that was audible even over the roar of the storm, and Mae opened it. Martin Granger stood on her step. He was soaked to the bone, his dark hat pulled low against the rain, his coat dark with water. He had his own lantern in one hand, and it was losing its fight with the storm, sputtering and flickering with every gust. He was looking at her with an expression that was entirely practical and not at all pitying, and he said, over the noise of the wind, "I saw your roof go from the road. How bad is it?" Mae stared at him for a moment. He was not a man she knew well. He was the hand from the Wren Ranch, the quiet one who sat in the second-to-last pew and never started conversations at the feed store. She knew his name because in a town the size of Caldwell you knew everyone's name within a month. She said, "The back bedroom is open to the sky." He said, "Can I come in?" She stepped back and let him. He came through the front room and looked at the back bedroom and assessed the damage with the focused attention of someone cataloging facts rather than expressing opinions about them. He walked to the threshold, holding his lantern up, and examined the break and the spreading water and the strain on the remaining joists, and then he came back and he said, "The rest of it will likely hold tonight if we can relieve some of the weight. Do you have a ladder?" "In the barn," Mae said. "Rope?" "Yes, tarp or canvas. I have a wagon tarp." He nodded, and then he went back out into the storm, and Mae pulled her coat tighter and followed him, because the barn was hers and she knew where things were, and she was not the kind of woman to stand inside while someone else worked on her property in the dark and the rain. They worked for 2 hours in the storm. It was difficult and wet, and twice the wind knocked the ladder sideways, and once Mae came very close to sliding off the roof entirely before Martin caught her arm and held her until she got her footing, and he did not say anything about it except, "Careful," in a level voice, and then they went back to the business of securing the tarp across the break with rope lashed to the chimney and the peak board. It was not a beautiful repair. It was a functional one, the kind you make in an emergency at 2 in the morning in a Kansas thunderstorm when the only alternative is watching everything you own get ruined. By the time they climbed down for the last time and the tarp was as secure as it was going to be, the worst of the storm had moved east. The rain was still falling, but without the violence it had carried at its peak, and the lightning had become distant, walking away across the plains in long, slow flashes. Mae's lantern had gone out entirely. Martin's was barely alive, the flame reduced to a thin blue thread. They stood in the barn out of the rain, both of them soaked through, breathing hard from the exertion of the last 2 hours. Mae could feel her hair plastered to the back of her neck and water in her boots and a scrape along her left palm from where she had caught the rough edge of the roof board. She became aware, gradually, of the profound silence between them, not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who are too tired to say anything yet. Martin looked at the scrape on her palm. He looked at it directly, and then he looked at her face, and he said, "You are bleeding." Mae looked at her hand. She said, "It is minor." He said, "I know," and then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of cloth, not a bandage, just the kind of clean cotton square a careful man kept in a pocket, and held it out to her. She took it and pressed it to her palm, and they stood there in the smell of hay and rain and wet horse while his lantern gave up its last bit of flame and went dark. In the dark she said, "You rode by on the road." He said, "I was checking the fence lines. The Wren property runs close." She said, "In the middle of a storm." A pause. "Elias asked me to check the line on the east pasture before the worst of it hit. I was riding back." Mae pressed the cloth against her palm. Outside, the rain was quieting by degrees. She said, "You did not have to stop." Martin said, "The roof was caved in." She said, "I know, I was handling it." There was a silence that had a very specific quality to it, and then Martin said, carefully, "You were handling it alone, in a storm, in the middle of the night." Mae said, "Yes." He said, "That is one way to do it." She did not know, in the darkness of the barn with rain dripping from the roof and both of them soaked through, whether he was mocking her or respecting her or something more complicated than either. She said, "What is another way?" He said, "This," and his voice was quiet enough that she had to strain to hear it over the rain. She left it there. She was too tired to parse it and too honest to pretend she did not know what he meant. She said, "Come inside. I will make coffee." He hesitated for just a moment, and then he followed her out of the barn and across the yard and into the front room of the Keene homestead, where the lamp was still burning, and the trunk was pushed against the wall, and the stove was still radiating the last of its warmth. The back bedroom was covered now, the rain silenced behind the tarp, and the front room was dry and lit and small, and Martin Granger filled it differently than Thomas had, which was the first time Mae had thought that thought, and she immediately set it aside. She put water on for coffee and found the cloth and the small bottle of whiskey she kept for medicinal purposes and cleaned the scrape on her palm and wrapped it with proper efficiency. Martin sat in the wooden chair near the door, which was not Thomas's chair, and he took off his hat and held it in his hands and looked at the floor with the expression of a man who was trying to take up as little space as possible out of some instinct for courtesy. Mae said, "Have you eaten?" He said, "I am fine." She made the coffee and also, because she was too tired to argue with herself about it, sliced bread and found the end of a cooked ham and put it on the table. And he ate it without protest, and she ate across from him, and neither of them talked much, and it was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that settles between two people who have done hard work together and are resting from it, and Mae was too practical and too exhausted to pretend it was not exactly that. After a while, Martin said, "The tarp will hold for now, but the roof will need proper repair before the next rain." Mae said, "I know." He said, I could come back and do it. I have 2 days off this week, Thursday and Friday. Me looked at him across the table. She looked at him carefully, the way she looked at things she was trying to understand accurately. She said, "Why?" He met her eyes and held them without flinching. He said, "Because the roof needs to be fixed." "You barely know me," she said. "I know you need a roof," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "People in this town have been offering me help for 3 months, and every one of them has wanted something from it. They wanted me to be grateful in a way that acknowledged their generosity. They wanted me to stop being difficult. They wanted to feel better about their own situations by helping the widow." She paused. "What do you want from it?" Martin turned his hat over in his hands. He said, "I do not want anything from it. I want the roof fixed because leaving it the way it is would bother me." Me said, "It would bother you." "Yes. A practical concern," she said. "Yes," he said, and then honestly, among other things. Me looked at him. Something shifted in the room, something small and cautious, the way a spring flower tests the air before committing to opening. She said, "Thursday, then." He nodded. He put on his hat and said good night and went out to his horse, which had been sheltering patient and enormous against the side of the barn, and he rode back toward the Wren Ranch in the rain-clean dark. And me sat in Thomas's chair with her coffee cooling in her hands and thought about the way the evening had gone, and decided that it was what it was and nothing more, and also that she was not entirely sure she believed herself. Thursday came with a clean sky and a heat that was softer than it had been in weeks, as if the storm had wrung something from the air that had been making everything harder. Martin arrived at the Keene homestead at 7 in the morning with lumber in the bed of a borrowed wagon and a toolbox he had been using since he was 17 years old, and me met him in the yard with coffee in a tin cup that she held out without ceremony, and he took with a thank you that was equally unceremonious, and they went up to look at the roof together in the morning light. The damage was worse in daylight than it had felt in the storm. The hole was ragged and large, and the joists on either side of it had been more compromised than the tarp and the darkness had allowed them to see. Martin stood on the roof and pressed each board with the flat of his hand and listened to the sounds they made and said, "We need to replace about twice what I brought. I can go back to the mill." Me said from her position on the ladder beside him, "I will come with you. I should be the one ordering the materials." He said, "All right." They drove the wagon to the mill together, which meant they drove through the main street of Caldwell on a Thursday morning, with Mae Keene sitting beside Martin Granger on the wagon bench. And me noticed the looks they received, and noticed that they did not particularly disturb her. Ruth Hannigan was on the boardwalk outside the dry goods store, and she watched them pass with an expression that me could not fully read from a distance, but that contained several emotions layered one on top of the other, which was the way Ruth Hannigan usually looked when she was trying to decide how to feel about something. At the mill, me ordered the lumber and paid for it with money from the careful reserve she had been maintaining since Thomas died, and the mill man, a broad German named Schraber who had been in Kansas for 20 years and had opinions about everything, looked from me to Martin and back and said, "You are fixing the Keene roof." To Martin, as if me were not standing right there. Martin said, "Mrs. Keene is fixing her roof. I am helping." Schraber gave Martin a look of slight bafflement, and me a look of something she chose not to examine, and they loaded the lumber and drove back through town. Working on the roof that Thursday was different from the emergency work of Tuesday night. It was daylight. They could see what they were doing. There was a rhythm to it, Martin cutting and setting and me handing and holding, and doing the parts that did not require a depth of carpentry experience she did not have. And within an hour they had found the efficient, wordless communication of two people who are good at working, and have both had enough of unnecessary conversation. Me discovered that she had an aptitude for following the logic of a repair, even when she did not know all the technical steps. And Martin discovered that Mae Keene did not need to be told anything twice, and that this was not a small thing. Midday she brought water and they sat on the roof in the sun, which felt like a liberty and also like the most reasonable place in the world to sit. Martin drank his water and looked out over the flat Kansas landscape and said, "You can see a long way from up here." Mae said, "I have sat up here before. Thomas and I used to come up in the evenings sometimes and watch the sun go down." A pause. Martin said, "I am sorry about Thomas." Mae said, "Thank you." She said it in the simple, direct way she received condolences that she believed to be genuine, without the additional performance of grief that some people seem to expect. Martin said, "How long were you married?" 4 years, Mae said. "We came out from Ohio in '79. He had the idea of it and I thought it sounded like an adventure." "Did it turn out to be one?" Mae considered the question seriously, which was the way she considered most things. She said, "Yes, though not always the pleasant kind." Martin said, "No, the plains have a way of being honest about that." She looked at him. "Were you ever married?" "No," he said. "By choice." He was quiet for a moment and she thought she might have overstepped, but then he said, "By circumstance mostly. I moved around a lot. It is hard to build something when you are always moving." He paused. "I stopped moving when I came here." Mae said, "You have only been here since February." "I know," he said, "but I stopped." She did not say anything more about it. She handed him another board and they went back to work. By evening the roof was whole. Not beautiful, it had the honest workmanship of a repair job rather than original construction, but sound, waterproof, and built to last through whatever the Kansas sky decided to bring next. Martin climbed down the ladder for the last time as the sun was beginning to dip, and Mae stood in the yard and looked up at the repaired section and felt something that took her a moment to name. It was relief, partly. But there was something else under it, something that had to do with standing next to someone who had looked at the thing she needed and simply done it without commentary or expectation. She said, "Come to supper." He said, "You do not have to." She said, "I know I do not have to. Come to supper." He said, "All right." She made beans and salt pork and cornbread, which was what she had, and they ate at the table where they had eaten the improvised midnight meal 2 nights before. But this time, there was enough light to see each other clearly and enough ease between them, that the silence was not the exhausted silence of emergency, but something quieter and more deliberate. Martin ate with genuine appetite and thanked her with genuine sincerity, and Mae felt the unfamiliar warmth of feeding someone who meant it. She said, "I want to ask you something directly." He said, "All right." She said, "Why did you come back, not to the house, I mean to Caldwell? Why did you stop moving here specifically?" Martin set down his fork. He said, "Elias Wren is a fair man and the work is honest." "That is part of it," Mae said. He looked at her. He said, "Yes." She waited. He said, "I came into town for the first time in February to buy feed, and there was a woman at the counter of the feed store arguing with Bert Holloway about the price of chicken feed, and she was entirely right and entirely calm, and she did not back down once, and I thought." He stopped. "You thought," Mae said. "I thought I would like to know that woman's name," he said. Mae was quiet for a long time. The stove ticked. Outside, the evening insects had started their work. She said, "That is a very inconvenient thing to tell me." He said, "I know," she said. "I am 3 months widowed." "I know that too," he said, she said, "and I told this entire town that I did not need anyone." He said, "You told this entire town that you could stand on your own 2 feet. That is not the same thing as not needing anyone. Those are different statements." Mae looked at him sharply. No one had made that distinction before, and it was exactly the right one, and the rightness of it irritated her slightly in the way that things do when they are so accurate they cannot be dismissed. She said, "You are a careful listener," he said, "when something is worth listening to." Mae stood up and took the plates to the basin and stood with her back to him for a moment, looking at the wall. She said, "I will need help fixing the kitchen window frame before winter. The wood has rotted." Martin said, "I can help with that." She turned around, she said, "And I need someone to show me the proper way to turn Thomas's soil over for the fall planting. He had a system I only partly understand." Martin said, "I can do that." Mae said, "I'm not asking you to take care of me." He said, "I know." She said, "I am asking you to." She paused, and the pause had difficulty in it, the difficulty of a proud and careful woman reaching for something. "Help," with specific things that I need help with. Martin said, "Me," she said. "What?" He said, "Yes, I will help." She said, "Good." And then, because she was Mae Keene and she did not do things by half, and you should know that I am going to be difficult and stubborn and independent about most of it. He said, "I know," she said, "and that does not bother you." He said, "It is one of the things I admire most." She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was the closest thing she permitted herself to shy. Then she said, "Good night, Martin." He said, "Good night, me," and he picked up his hat and went out, and she heard Duster's hoofbeats retreating on the road, and she stood at the window and watched the dust settle in the last of the light, and thought that she had perhaps been more honest with herself about some things than she had been in a long time. Word got around, because word always got around in Caldwell. Ruth Hannigan told the doctor, who mentioned it to Elias Wren in passing, who said nothing to Martin except that he had Fridays off as well as Thursdays if he needed them for personal reasons, in the way of a man who knows what he knows and keeps it where it belongs. Bert Holloway made one comment at the feed store to the effect that he had thought Mae Keene did not need anyone, and the woman standing next to him at the counter, a cattle rancher's wife named Alice Bright who had her own opinions about solitude and necessity, said, "Bert, not everything means what you think it means." And that was the end of that particular conversation. Mae continued to operate her farm. She was not deluded about what she understood and what she did not. And so she studied, and she asked questions where she had to, and she made mistakes, and learned from them with a lack of self-pity that impressed Sam Garfield, who had started coming 4 mornings a week instead of 3, because the work was more interesting, and Mrs. Keene talked to him like a person. She sold the extra eggs in town, and used the money for seed, and preserved her fall vegetables with the focused efficiency of someone who had been doing it for years, even though she had only been doing it for 2. She was not happy in the way people used the word casually, but she was alive in a way that felt real, which she thought might be better. Martin came on Thursdays. He had established this rhythm with no particular conversation about it, simply the agreement they had reached over beans and salt pork, and it held without examination. He fixed the kitchen window frame in August and turned the soil in the way Thomas had described in his journals, and repaired the latch on the barn door, and replaced a section of the front fence that had been leaning dangerously since June. In exchange, Mae fed him supper. She told herself it was a fair trade of labor, and she believed it, and also knew that it was more than the labor that made Thursday feel like a different day than the other 6. They talked in the way of people who have found each other interesting, and have not yet used up all the things they want to say. Martin told her about Texas, about growing up in a family of 4 boys where everything was contested and nothing was quiet, and he had learned to find peace in the space between conversations rather than in them. Mae told him about Ohio, about a father who was a school teacher and a mother who was a gardener, and the particular quality of an Ohio childhood, full of green things and seasons with clear borders, that had not prepared her at all for the Kansas plains, and had also, in some obscure way she was still working out, given her exactly what she needed to survive them. She told him about Thomas. Not the grief of it, which she kept where it lived, in the private hours before dawn, but Thomas himself, his humor and his stubbornness, and the way he had held a vision of the future in his mind so clearly that it had been easy to follow it, and the particular disorientation of being left in a future you had been building together without the person you had been building it for. Martin listened. He did not try to simplify it or fix it. He understood that she was not asking him to do either of those things, and he did not do them. September arrived and the heat finally broke, and the plains turned golden in the way they did every fall, that vast amber sweep that made the world look like something out of a painting, and made the wind smell of grass and dryness and the specific melancholy of seasons ending. Mae's wheat had come in. Not abundantly, not the way Thomas had projected, but enough. enough to sell half and keep half and call the season something other than a failure. She drove the wagon to town on the first market day of September with the wheat in sacks and Sam Garfield beside her on the bench, and she sold it for a fair price and felt the satisfaction of a thing she had done herself from beginning to end. Martin was in town that day. She saw him outside the general store, talking to a man she did not recognize, someone in a suit that looked too clean for Caldwell and who had the air of someone from the land office. Martin was listening to whatever the man was saying with the still, contained expression he put on when he was deciding something, and Mae drove past and did not stop, but she watched in her peripheral vision and saw the conversation end, and the suited man shake Martin's hand and leave, and Martin watched him go with an expression she could not read. She found out later, from the particular social mechanics of a small town that she had learned to navigate without needing to participate in them, that the man from the land office had offered Martin a foreman position at a ranch outside of Wichita. It was a significant step up from his current work, more money, more authority, a house that came with the position rather than a bunk in a shared room at the Wren place. It was the kind of offer a man in Martin's position did not receive twice. She did not bring it up on Thursday. She fed him supper, and they talked about the fall planting and the condition of the south pasture fence, and a book she had been reading that had come in a shipment to the general store, a novel that she had strong opinions about, and he listened to her opinions and disagreed with one of them on good grounds, which she appreciated because she had no patience for people who agreed with everything to avoid friction. But the thing from the land office sat in the room with them like a presence, and when he left that night, she stood in the doorway watching his lantern disappear down the road and thought about distance and choices and the peculiar arithmetic of deciding what you value. The next Thursday he came, and the one after that. The window frame held, the barn latch worked, the wheat was sold, the hens laid through September in a spirit of generosity that Mae found both useful and slightly comic. She had not replaced the 3 she had bartered away, and she thought she should, and she mentioned this to Martin, who said he knew a woman in the next county who kept excellent laying hens and could probably get her 2 or 3 at a reasonable price, and Mae said that would be useful, and they agreed he would inquire. It was in October, on a Thursday evening when the first real cold of the season had come in, and Mae had lit the stove earlier than usual and the smell of wood smoke was in the room, that Martin set down his coffee cup and said, "I want to tell you something." Mae said, "All right," he said, "I turned down the Wichita position." She said, "I know." He looked at her. He said, "How do you know?" She said, "Cody Wren mentioned it to Sam Garfield at the mill. Sam mentioned it to me." Martin said, "The information landscape of this town is extraordinary." "Yes," Mae said. "Why did you turn it down?" He held his coffee cup in both hands and he looked at her across the table with the direct, uncomplicated honesty that was, she had come to understand, simply the way he was made. He said, "Because I did not want to go to Wichita." "That is not a sufficient reason to turn down a foreman position," Mae said. He said, "No, it is not by itself." He paused. "I turned it down because what I want is here," Mae said. "And what do you want?" He set the cup down. He said, "You know what I want, Mae." She was quiet. The stove ticked. The wind had gotten up outside and was pressing against the window in the way it did in October, intimate and persistent. She said, "I am not an easy woman." "I know," he said. She said, "I told this whole town I needed no one and I mostly meant it." He said, "I know," she said, "and you are still here." "Yes," he said. She said, "Every Thursday." "Yes," she said. "Martin," he said. "Me," she said. "I have not been ready. I want you to know that it was not stubbornness about you specifically. I have not been ready." He said, "I know that too." She said very quietly, "I think I might be getting there." The thing that happened then was not dramatic in the way of a novel or a story that wants to make itself feel important. It was simple. Martin reached across the table and put his hand over hers, over the palm where the scrape from the roof had healed to a thin pink line, and she looked at his hand on hers, and then she looked at his face and she said nothing else, and neither did he. and the stove ticked, and the wind pressed at the window, and the lamplight moved over the room in the comfortable way of a lamp that has been lit in the same place enough times to feel like it belongs there. November came, and with it, the social obligations of a small western town that contracted around itself in cold weather like an organism finding warmth in proximity. There was the autumn church social, which Mae had attended last year in the raw newness of recent widowhood, and which she attended this year with a composure that had deepened into something that looked almost like contentment. Martin was there, because Elias Wren attended, and Elias brought his men to social occasions in the expectation that they would comport themselves well, and Martin sat across the room from me for the first half of the evening, with the careful distance of a man who has not yet asked a woman publicly what they have agreed to privately. Ruth Hannigan, who was a fundamentally kind woman despite her tendency towards certain assumptions, made her way to Mae's side during the pie portion of the evening and said, in a low and confidential voice, "I have noticed that Mr. Granger from the Wren Ranch spends considerable time at your property." Mae said, "He has been helping with repairs." Ruth said, "And Thursdays, that is a great many repairs." Mae looked at her. She said, "Ruth." Ruth said, "Me." Mae said, "If you have a question, ask it directly. You know I prefer that." Ruth took a breath and said, "Are you and Martin Granger?" "Yes," Mae said. Ruth blinked. She said, "Yes what?" I did not finish the question. Mae said, "Yes to whatever the question was going to be." She paused. "Within reason." Ruth looked at her for a moment and then she laughed, which was a genuine and warm laugh, and she said, "I am so glad, Mae," and Mae allowed herself to be hugged briefly, which was a significant concession and one Ruth accepted with appropriate appreciation. Across the room, Martin looked up from his conversation with Elias Wren and found Mae's eyes, and she gave him the smallest nod in the world, and he understood it completely. December in Caldwell was cold in the way the Kansas plains were cold, a wind-driven cold that found every gap in every wall and made the town draw its breath inward and slow down. The cattle trade that had made Caldwell significant was in its winter pause, and the town had the particular quiet of a place that was still very much alive but conducting its life at a lower, more interior volume. Mae's stove worked hard and her woodpile was solid, the result of Martin's insistence in October that she needed more wood than she had, and his 3 Saturdays spent splitting it with a single-mindedness that she had watched through the kitchen window with a feeling she was no longer pretending to herself, was purely practical observation. He had asked her in November, simply and without theater, on a Thursday evening when the coffee was done and the conversation had reached one of its comfortable silences. He had said, "Mae, I would like to court you properly if you are agreeable to it." She had said, "We have been having supper together every Thursday for 4 months." He had said, "That is not the same thing and you know it." She had said, "It is a lot of supper." He had said, "Me." She had said, "Yes, Martin, I am agreeable to it." The thing about being courted by Martin Granger, Mae discovered, was that it looked very much like everything that had come before it and was also entirely different. He came on Thursdays and stayed longer. He came on some Saturdays too. He brought her things, not grand or expensive things but useful ones. A new set of tin cups when he noticed hers were dented, 3 laying hens from the woman in the next county, a bag of the particular flour she mentioned preferring over the one the general store usually carried. He found out, through channels she never entirely traced, that she had loved oranges as a child and had not had one in years, and a crate arrived from Wichita in November with 6 of them packed in straw, and when she looked at him over the crate he shrugged with the one-shouldered gesture of a man pretending not to have put significant effort into something. She gave him things in return. The book she had finished with opinions still fresh on it. Suppers that grew more elaborate over the course of autumn, not because she was trying to impress him, but because cooking for someone who appreciated it brought out an interest in the craft she had not known she had. She told him things she had not told anyone, about the nights when the grief for Thomas came in hard, about the particular fear she had of losing the farm, about the way she sometimes thought the plains were the loneliest landscape on earth, and also the only one in which she felt she fully fit. He received all of it without alarm and without unsolicited solutions, and this was worth more to her than almost anything else. Christmas came and the town of Caldwell celebrated it with the particular frontier exuberance of people who knew how to find festivity in modest circumstances. The church was decorated with boughs of dried grass, and what few pine branches could be brought at considerable expense from Wichita, and the Caldwell Ladies' Circle organized a dinner for the whole town in the large room behind the church that served as a meeting hall. Mae went and brought 3 pies, which was 2 more than she had brought last year, and she sat at the long table in the warmth and noise and ate and talked and allowed herself to feel, for the first time since Thomas died, that she was part of something rather than adjacent to it. Martin sat beside her. This was noted. This was accepted. Bert Holloway made a face at his wife that she silenced with a look, and Ruth Hannigan smiled in the particular satisfied way of someone who had been right about a thing and was choosing not to say so. And Preacher Aldous Dowd said grace in a way that managed to make a general reference to the healing power of community that Mae recognized as directed at no one and everyone. After supper, Martin walked her home through the cold dark, which was not quite 2 miles, but was long enough that the walking had a purpose beyond the distance. The sky was extraordinary. A clear December sky over the plains is a thing you remember if you have seen it. The stars so dense and so close in the dry, cold air that they seem 3-dimensional rather than flat, the Milky Way a brushstroke from one horizon to the other. Mae stopped on the road and looked up and said, "I never stop being surprised by that." Martin stood beside her and looked up too. He said, "In Texas, we used to sleep outside in summer and wake up under it. I thought I was used to it, and then I came here and the sky is bigger and I had to start over." Mae said, "The sky is bigger here. I do not know how that is possible, but it is." They stood there in the cold and the extraordinary dark for a long moment, both of them looking up, and then Martin put his arm around her shoulders. He had not done this before, and she felt it as a warmth that was more than the practical warmth of it, and she leaned into it a small amount, and they stood there until the cold made the standing impractical, and then they walked on to the Keene homestead with his arm still around her shoulders and the stars doing what they had been doing since before there were people to notice. At her door he said, "Mae." She said, "Yes." He said, "I love you." He said it the way he said most things, directly, without decoration, as if it were a fact he was reporting rather than a risk he was taking, though she understood that it was both. She looked at him in the light that came through the window. She looked at his face that she had been looking at for the better part of a year and had come to know as well as any landscape she had lived in. She said, "I love you too. It frightens me and I am telling you anyway." He said, "Why does it frighten you?" She said, "Because I loved Thomas and he left, not willingly, but he left, and love means..." She stopped. She tried again. "Love means something can be taken." Martin said, "Yes." She said, "You are agreeing with me rather than reassuring me." He said, "I am not going to tell you the fear is wrong. You have good reasons for it. What I can tell you is that I intend to stay in this town beside you for as long as you will let me." Mae said, "That is the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me about this." He said, "I am an honest man." She said, "I know." And then she kissed him, because she was Mae Keene, and when she decided on a thing she did it. And it was a kiss that was neither cautious nor performative but simply true, and he kissed her back with the same honesty, and the Kansas night was cold and vast and brilliant above them, and it did not matter at all. The winter passed in the way of winters that are shared, slower and warmer and full of things that the summer had been too busy for. Martin proposed in January, on a Thursday evening in the Keene kitchen, with the stove going hard and snow on the ground outside for the second time in Caldwell's recent memory. He did it without a ring because he wanted to get her one herself, with her, so it would be the right thing, which was so completely the way he thought that Mae laughed when he told her, and then said yes. They went to the general store the next week and looked at what was available, which was not extensive in a town of Caldwell's size, but included a small gold band with a single chip of turquoise that Mae held in her palm for a long time, and then looked at Martin and said, "This one." He paid for it and put it on her finger right there in the general store with Mr. and Mrs. Brower, looking on with expressions of benign delight, and Mae walked out of the store wearing it into the cold January air, and felt the weight of it as something she had chosen rather than something that had been decided for her, which was the only way she ever wanted to feel about anything. The wedding was in March of 1883, when the Kansas plains were beginning to think about spring without fully committing to it yet. The grass still brown, but with a suggestion of green underneath that you could see if you knew what you were looking at. Preacher Dowd married them in the church with approximately the entire town of Caldwell in attendance, because a wedding was a wedding, and especially a wedding between the woman who had told everyone she needed no one and the quiet man from the Wren Ranch who had come when her roof caved in and stayed for everything after. Mae wore the dress she and Ruth Hannigan had made together over 4 Saturdays in January and February, a dark blue wool that was practical and also beautiful in a way that did not require impracticality, and her dark hair was down for once, falling past her shoulders, and Martin stood at the front of the church and watched her walk down the aisle, and his expression was the expression of a man seeing something he had not fully let himself believe in until this moment. Elias Wren stood with Martin as his witness. Ruth Hannigan stood with me. The vows were the traditional ones, and Mae said them with her eyes on Martin's face and her voice steady and clear, because she was Mae Keene, and she did not flinch from things she meant. And Martin said them back to her in the quiet, certain voice that she had loved from the first time she had really heard it, in her barn in the storm dark, telling her the roof was caved in as if it were simply a problem they were going to solve. Bert Holloway cried at the back of the church, which everyone pretended not to notice, and even Preacher Dowd seemed moved, though he maintained the professional expression of a man who had seen many weddings and found them all equally significant. Afterward there was a supper in the hall behind the church, the same hall where they had eaten their Christmas dinner, and it went long into the evening with food and music from Cody Wren, who played the fiddle better than you would have guessed a foreman's son would, and Mae and Martin danced in the way of two people who had not danced together before but found, when they tried, that they fit. Martin had spoken to Elias Wren in December about the future, about what he wanted and what was possible. Elias was a fair man and he valued Martin's work, and they had come to an arrangement that Martin told me about in January, a wage increase and a new position as head ranch hand, which came with more responsibility and also the use of a small house on the eastern edge of the Wren property. But Mae's farm was the farm, and the plan was to work both. Martin's work for Elias would support them, and Mae's homestead would be what she built, with his help when she needed it and her own hands the rest of the time. Mae had agreed to this with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had been offered something that matched exactly what she would have designed for herself if she had been given the designing. She was not going to become someone else's wife in the sense of disappearing into the role. She was going to be Mae Granger and run her farm and sell her eggs and grow her wheat and be, in parallel to all of that, Martin Granger's wife, which was a thing she had arrived at from her own direction and on her own terms, and which she therefore held with both hands. They lived on the farm, not in the house on the Wren property, because the farm was Mae's and the farm was where she was building her life. Martin rode to the Wren Ranch each morning and returned each evening, and this rhythm suited them both in the way of arrangements that respect the shape of the people involved. He was good at coming home. He had the particular quality of a man who brings the full weight of his presence to a place, and so makes it feel, in the moment of arrival, as if something essential has just returned. Mae did not entirely admit this to herself until the 3rd month of marriage, and then she admitted it with the brisk matter-of-factness she applied to most facts, including the ones about herself. The spring of 1883 was a better growing season than the summer of '82 had been. The rains came on a reasonable schedule, and the creek ran full, and the wheat that Mae planted with the technique Martin had shown her from Thomas's journals came in strong and even, row after row of it going green across the field in a way that made her stand at the edge of the field in April and breathe in deeply, with the precise emotion of someone who has worked very hard for something and is seeing it begin to work. Sam Garfield, who was now 15 and had developed the particular tall, angular awkwardness of a boy crossing toward manhood, continued to come 3 mornings a week, and had absorbed enough of Mae's exacting standards to be genuinely useful in a way that went beyond simple labor. Mae taught him to read the weather and understand the soil and keep the account book, because she believed that knowledge given was never wasted, and because Sam was sharp and attentive and deserved to have someone take him seriously. The laying hens that Martin had sourced from the woman in the next county were excellent birds, productive and sturdy, and Mae expanded to 12 hens by summer and began supplying eggs regularly to the hotel in Caldwell, which was new and ambitious and required more eggs than the local farms had previously been managing. The hotel owner, a woman from Denver named Bess Cartwright, who had come to Caldwell with money and ideas, and the particular energy of someone who had decided to make something happen in a place that was not expecting it, appreciated Mae's efficiency and told her so in direct terms that Mae appreciated in return. It was through Bess Cartwright, who knew everyone in Caldwell within 6 weeks of arriving and had strong opinions about which of those people were worth knowing, that Mae learned in May of 1883 that there was a movement forming to establish a proper school in Caldwell. The one that existed was a single room with a rotation of temporary teachers who came and went on the wind like everything else, and Bess had decided that a town with ambitions needed a school with stability, and she was organizing accordingly. Mae went to the meeting about the school, because she was her father's daughter and education was not a thing she was neutral about. She arrived to find 11 other people already there, including Ruth Hannigan and her husband and Elias Wren, and to her private amusement, Bert Holloway, who apparently had strong feelings about education that he had never made evident in his public persona as the man who thought prices were simple. She joined the committee. She became, by the second meeting, the person who kept the records and organized the contributions and wrote the letters to the Territorial Education Office, because she was efficient and wrote a clear and forceful letter, and had no patience for process that did not move. Martin came to the third meeting and sat at the back and listened and said nothing until the question of funding came up, and then he said, simply, "Elias has a stand of timber on the north property that he has been meaning to clear. The wood could be used for construction." And Elias Wren, who had not known this was going to be said, looked at Martin for a moment and then nodded, because Martin had correctly assessed both the timber and Elias' willingness to donate it. The school was built that fall. It was a modest building, 2 rooms rather than 1, with windows on both sides and a good stove, and a teacher's desk that Mae had insisted be made properly rather than simply sturdily. The first permanent teacher was a young woman from Missouri named Clara Devlin, who arrived in September with 2 trunks and an enormous amount of organized energy, and took to Caldwell with the enthusiasm of someone who had been looking for a place to matter. Mae liked her immediately, which was not something Mae did with everyone, and Clara Devlin stayed in Caldwell for the next 20 years, which was long enough to teach the children of people she had taught, and to see the town become something more than the sum of its original ambitions. In August of 1883, Mae told Martin she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning before he left for the Wren Ranch, standing in the kitchen in her apron with the stove already going, and she said it the way she said most things, directly and without decoration, but with something underneath the directness that was visible if you knew how to look at her. He stood very still for a moment, and then he crossed the kitchen and he held her carefully and completely, with his arms around her and his chin resting on the top of her head, and neither of them said anything for a long time. When he pulled back, he looked at her face. He said, "Are you—" "I am more than all right," she said. "I am frightened and I am more than all right." He said, "Tell me about the frightened part." She said, "I am 40 miles from a proper hospital. Winter is coming. I have never—" She stopped. She said, "I have never done this." He said, "Neither have I, but Ruth Hannigan's husband is a doctor and he has delivered half the children in this county, and you are the most capable person I have ever met in my life, and we will do it together." Mae said, "You cannot do this part together. This part is mine." He said, "I know. I will be in the other room, and you will do the part that is yours, and I will do the part that is mine, and those things together are what together means." She looked at him. She said, "That is a very sensible way to put it." He said, "I thought you would appreciate sensible." She said, "I do," and she allowed herself to lean against him again for another moment before straightening up and going back to the work of the morning. The pregnancy progressed through the fall and into the winter with the particular strange quality of a body doing something entirely new. Mae was sick in September and recovered in October, and found in November that she was hungrier than she had ever been in her life and also more tired. And she managed both conditions with the pragmatic accommodation she applied to weather and difficult soil, noting them, adapting to them, not requiring them to be otherwise. She continued to run the farm, adjusting the work as her body required it, and Martin took up more of the physical labor without being asked, and without making it a point of conversation, simply doing what needed doing with the same efficiency he brought to everything. And she loved him for it and told him so, and he said, "This is not something I need credit for." And she said, "I know, that is why I am giving it." She also, in this period, had a conversation she had been postponing with herself for some time. The conversation was about the farm's future, about what she was building and for whom and how she thought about it. Thomas had had a vision for it. She had taken that vision and made it her own over the past 2 years, but she had been so focused on survival and then on recovery that she had not fully asked herself what she actually wanted the farm to become beyond the next season. She thought about it through the long November evenings when the dark came early, and she sat with her mending or her book, while Martin read the almanac or wrote letters to his brothers in Texas, in the careful, deliberate handwriting of a man who had taught himself to write well after a childhood where it was not particularly valued. She watched him at the table and thought about roots and what they meant, and where they grew. She thought about her father's garden in Ohio, the way he had tended it not for a single season but for decades, so that every spring it came up with the accumulated richness of all the years before. She thought about something that could be handed to a child. She talked to Martin about it one evening in December. She said, "I want to expand the herd." He looked up from the almanac. He said, "Chickens. And possibly some cattle," she said. "A few head, not a cattle operation. Something small that could grow." He said, "The south field would carry it." She said, "I know, I have been thinking about the south field." He said, "And the wheat." "And the wheat," she said. "A farm that grows more than one thing is harder to lose entirely." He looked at her with the expression she had come to know as his version of deep attention, the one that meant he was fully present and taking her seriously in the way she required and deserved. He said, "All right, let us plan it." They planned it together over the course of December, spread out on the table with the maps Thomas had made, and the new ones Mae had added to, and the account book that showed a farm that was not yet profitable but was getting there, and they drew the future of it in pencil lines and margin notes, and a seriousness that was also, somehow, a pleasure. Their son was born in March of 1884. Dr. Hannigan was there, and Ruth Hannigan, and it was a long and difficult night that Mae Granger got through in the way she got through hard things, which was by working through every moment of it with all of herself. Martin sat in the kitchen with his hands around a cold cup of coffee, and waited with the particular anguish of a man who is used to being able to do something, and has found the one situation where there is nothing to do. He heard his wife's voice from the other room, never in the voice of a woman giving up, but in the voice of a woman working, and he held that distinction in his mind through the whole of that long night. When the baby came, Martin heard it before anyone opened the door. He heard it because the sound was entirely new and also entirely expected, and he was on his feet before Ruth Hannigan appeared in the doorway with her hands still busy and her face soft in the lamplight. She said, "A boy. Both of them are well." Martin went into the room. Mae was exhausted in the absolute way of someone who has just done the most demanding thing a human body does, and she was also entirely herself, lying back against the pillow with her hair loose and her color high, and the infant wrapped in the blue quilt they had made together in February because they had both decided they would be ready. She was looking at the baby with an expression Martin had never seen on her face before, which was startling because he thought he had by now cataloged most of her expressions. This one was entirely open, no defense, no careful management, just her full self looking at something it loved without reservation. She looked up when he came to the bed. She said, "Come and look." He came and looked. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the small, scrunched, red face of his son, and something happened inside him that he would not have been able to name or explain and did not try to. He said, "What should we call him?" Mae said, "I was thinking Thomas, for the middle name." "If that is all right." Martin said, "What for the first?" Mae said, "I want to name him something that is his own, not carried from anyone." She looked at the baby. She said, "James Thomas Granger." Martin said, "James Thomas Granger." He tried the sound of it in the warm room with the lamp burning and the March dark outside the window. He said, "Yes." Mae said, "He has your forehead." Martin said, "He has your expression. He already looks as if he is assessing something." Mae laughed, which was the sound Martin loved best in all the sounds he had learned to love. And outside the Kansas night was cold and clear, and the stars were doing their extraordinary thing. And inside the Keene homestead, Granger homestead now, though Mae kept the name on the deed as Keene because it was her father's name and she had rights to it, and Martin understood this with complete ease. The fire was warm and the coffee was cold, and none of that mattered in the slightest. The years passed in the way of years that are full. Not without hardship, because the Kansas plains did not offer anyone hardship-free years, but full in the way that means there is enough of what matters to carry you through what is difficult. A dry summer in '85 that tested the cattle plan but not terminally. A winter in '86 that was the hardest in a decade, and during which Mae and Martin and the infant James, who was by then nearly 2, spent 3 weeks mostly inside, burning through the woodpile Martin had built deep in November, playing cards and telling each other things, and discovering the particular intimacy of confinement that is shared rather than suffered. The school that Mae had helped build continued to grow, and Clara Devlin stayed, and the children of Caldwell grew up with more letters and more mathematics than the children of the towns around them, which became a point of civic pride that even Bert Holloway embraced with enthusiasm once he understood that pride in it was available and acceptable. Mae's farm expanded on the schedule she and Martin had planned. The small cattle herd grew to 12 head by 1885 and 20 by 1888, and the south field went to pasture, and the north field stayed in wheat, and the laying hens continued their reliable work of producing eggs for the hotel and for families in town who paid a fair price for quality. Sam Garfield, who had come 3 mornings a week as a 14-year-old boy in the worst summer of the decade, grew into a young man of 20 and came to me in the spring of 1888 with his hat in his hands and told her he wanted to ranch for himself, that he had saved money and found a piece of land 2 miles east, and that he wanted to know if she would teach him the things he still needed to know. Mae sat across from him at the kitchen table that had hosted more conversations than she could count and looked at the young man who had grown up under her exacting, honest, useful attention, and she said yes without hesitation, and she meant it, and she helped him get his start in the way that she helped things, practically, without sentiment, with exactly what was needed. James Thomas Granger was 4 when his sister was born in the summer of 1888. Mae had carried this pregnancy with more confidence than the first and more discomfort, which she endured without complaint and with slightly more willingness to sit down than she usually permitted herself. Martin noticed the sitting down and said nothing about it, only quietly took on more of the physical work, which was by now habitual between them in the way of married people who have found their natural balance and maintain it without needing to discuss it. The girl was born on a hot August night, and she came into the world with the particular confidence of a person who has decided to arrive and is doing so fully. Dr. Hannigan said she was the loudest infant he had delivered in 20 years. Mae looked at her daughter and felt the same open, undefended love she had felt for James, and also the additional weight of what it meant to bring a girl into the world, a world that she knew from thorough personal experience did not always receive women on their own terms. She said, "We will call her Clara," Martin said, "after the school teacher." Mae said, "After someone who came somewhere new and decided to make something matter." She looked at him, "And because I like the name." He said, "Clara Granger." She said, "Clara Mae Granger." He looked at her with the expression she had loved since a cold October evening when he had said, among other things, that he was one of the things he admired most. He said, "That is a good name." James, who was 4 and had come to understand that the world was mostly comprehensible if you observed it carefully enough, looked at his new sister from the doorway and said, "She is very loud." Mae said, "She is." And she smiled the smile of a woman who suspects that her daughter has inherited the better part of her own character, which was exactly right. Caldwell continued to be Caldwell, which meant it grew and changed and argued with itself, and reached beyond its own edges, and sometimes found what it was reaching for. The cattle trade that had defined its ambitions in the early years of the decade had shifted by the end of it, the long drives from Texas giving way to more local operations as the railroads pushed further and the business changed shape. Elias Wren adapted, because he was the kind of man who did, and Martin adapted with him, and the Wren Ranch remained one of the solid ones in the county when other operations that had been built too fast on too many assumptions failed in the hard winters and dry summers of the late 1880s. Martin was offered a partnership in the Wren operation in 1890. Elias' eldest son Cody had decided his future was in law rather than ranching, which had surprised Elias considerably, and which Elias had ultimately accepted with the grace of a man who understood that children grow in the direction they grow. Elias' second son had no interest in ranching and even less capacity for it. Elias was 58 and beginning to feel the weight of the decade in his joints, and Martin Granger was the most reliable person in the operation and had been for 8 years. The partnership was a practical offer, and Elias made it practically, and Martin brought it home and told me about it over supper. Mae listened. She said, "What would it mean in terms of your time?" Martin said, "More of it here, actually. Less riding and more managing. The house on the eastern edge of the property comes with it." He paused. "We would not have to leave the farm. The Wren property borders ours on the north. I have been looking at it." Mae said, "You have been thinking about this for a while," he said, "since Cody told me he was going to law school last spring," she said, "and you did not say anything." He said, "I did not want to say anything until it was real." Mae looked at him across the table where James was eating with the focused intensity of a 6-year-old who takes meals seriously, and Clara was in her high chair being inefficient with her food in the way of 2-year-olds, and the lamp was burning and the stove was warm and the farm outside the window was everything she had made it. She said, "Say yes." Martin said, "Are you certain?" Mae said, "You have given 8 years to that ranch, and Elias Wren is a fair man and the opportunity is real and you deserve it and we can afford it. Say yes." Martin said, "There will be lean months while we reorganize." Mae said, "There have always been lean months. We are good at lean months." He said, "Mae," she said, "Martin, say yes." He said yes, and Elias Wren shook his hand the next morning and said, I was hoping you would, with the satisfaction of a man who has solved a problem he had been carrying for a long time. The Granger and Wren operation, as it came to be called in the formal way of business arrangements in the county, was a good one. Martin brought to it the same methodical, honest attention he brought to everything, and Elias contributed the experience of a man who had been reading cattle and land for 40 years. And together, they built something that outlasted both of them in the way of things built on solid ground. Mae's farm had a new sign by 1891, the hand-lettered kind that you had done at the general store. Granger Farm, Est 1879. She had added the founding date because the farm had been founded in 1879, when Thomas Keene had first broken the ground, and that was the truth of it. And Mae Granger was a woman who preferred the truth even when it was complicated. Martin had looked at the sign when it went up and said nothing except, "That is right," which was exactly what she had needed to hear. James was 7 in 1891 and already showing an aptitude for the mechanical logic of things, how fences worked and why soil held certain kinds of water, and the way a wagon's wheel assembly distributed weight. He followed Martin on the Saturdays when Martin worked the farm rather than the ranch, with the focused attention of a boy learning the language of a world he intended to live in. And Martin taught him with the same patience and lack of condescension that Mae had always brought to teaching, because it was one of the many things about Mae he had absorbed without noticing. Clara was 3 and magnificent. She had Mae's jaw, that square, decided tilt, and Martin's eyes, and a voice that carried to an impressive distance, and opinions she expressed with complete confidence from the moment she had enough words to express them. She was, as Mae watched her navigate the world with absolute certainty that the world would conform to her requirements, equal parts alarming and deeply satisfying to observe. In the spring of 1892, Mae Granger received a letter from Ohio. Her mother, who had been living with her aunt since Mae's father had died 5 years before, was not well. She was not dying, but she was elderly and increasingly frail, and the aunt had written on her behalf to say that perhaps Mae might visit if she could. Mae sat with the letter for a long afternoon, and then talked to Martin, and then wrote back to say she was coming, and that she would arrive in May and stay through June. She had not been back to Ohio since she left it in 1879. 13 years. She was 38 years old, and she had built an entire life in the space between that departure and this moment. She packed with her usual practical efficiency, and Martin drove her to the station in the morning and held James by the hand, because at 8 years old James was old enough to understand what a temporary farewell meant, and to feel it without quite being able to manage it. Clara sat on Martin's arm and waved with enormous enthusiasm in the way of a 4-year-old, who does not fully understand what the waving is for, but has decided to commit to it. Mae leaned up and kissed Martin at the platform, which she did not care who saw, and he held her for a moment and said, "We will be here," she said. "I know." She said, "I will be back in June." He said, "Take all the time you need." She said, "I will take the time I need, and then I will come home." And then she got on the train and did not look out the window until she had composed herself. And then she looked out and watched the Kansas plains open up around her in the flat, grassy, enormous way they did, going on forever under a sky that went further still. Ohio was green in a way she had forgotten. Green and enclosed and full of trees that stood up and blocked the horizon, which felt suffocating for the first 2 days and beautiful for the rest. Her mother was smaller than she remembered and more fragile, but her mind was sharp, and her eyes were bright, and she told me stories she had never told before, the kind of stories older people save for when they have decided someone is ready to hear them. They sat on the aunt's porch in May evenings and talked in the way they had not talked when Mae was younger, about what mattered and what lasted and what a life was made of. Her mother said, "You sound different." Mae said, "I am different." Her mother said, "Happy." Mae considered the word honestly, which she had always done, because for Mae Keene Granger happiness was not a simple word. She said, I am built right for the life I am living. I am with someone I love and who loves me in the way I need to be loved. I have 2 children and a farm and a community I am part of without being consumed by it. I am often tired and occasionally frightened, and I would not trade any of it." She paused. "Is that happy?" her mother said. "That is better than happy." Mae came home in June, as she had said she would. The train came into the Caldwell station on a hot Thursday afternoon, and Martin was there on the platform with James beside him and Clara on his arm. And when Clara saw me, she produced a shriek of such concentrated joy that people on the platform who did not know them looked around to see what had caused it. Mae took her daughter and held her and felt the warm weight of the small, fierce body and looked over Clara's head at Martin, who was looking at her with everything he felt entirely visible in his face, making no attempt to contain it. She said, "I told you I would come home in June." He said, "I know," she said. "You worried anyway." He said, "Of course I did." She said, "Good." And she kissed him again on the platform, with James making a face and Clara attempting to participate. And the Caldwell station went about its business around them, with the warm, incurious acceptance of a community that had been watching me and Martin Granger be exactly themselves for 10 years, and had long since decided that this was simply how it was going to be. Mae's mother came to visit the following spring. Mae sent for her, arranged the journey, and met her at the station with the wagon and James, who at 9 was already tall enough that his grandmother looked up at him and said, "Well," with the particular compacted emotion of a grandmother who is seeing the future of her blood in the face of a boy she is meeting for the first time. Clara attached herself to the grandmother within the first hour with the confident assumption that all love was available to her, and the grandmother, for whom this was a new experience, found that she did not mind this at all. Mae's mother sat on the porch of the Granger farm in the warm April evenings and looked at the Kansas plains and said, "I understand now why you did not come back." Mae said, "Do you?" She said, "You cannot look at all that sky and want a smaller one." Mae said, "No, you cannot." The years settled into the shape of a life that has found its form. The farm grew, and the children grew, and Martin's partnership with Elias Wren produced a stable and respected operation that weathered the difficult years of the early 1890s better than most, through careful management and the particular quality of 2 people who understood that the land was not something to be used up but something to be maintained. Elias retired in 1894 and left his share of the operation to Martin formally, and Martin came home with the papers and set them on the table, and Mae read them and said, "Elias is a good man." Martin said, "He is." Mae said, "So are you." He looked at her with the expression she had loved since a barn in a storm in 1882, and she was 39 years old, and the farm was outside the window in the summer evening light, and James was doing something in the yard that sounded constructive, and Clara was reading in the other room with the focused concentration of a girl who read everything she could find and intended to read everything she had not yet found. And Martin reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The same hand he had covered in the same motion in the same kitchen 12 years before. She said, "You know what I think about sometimes," he said. "Tell me." She said, "That night with the storm and the roof." He said, "What about it?" She said, "I had told the whole town I needed no one. I was sitting in this room listening to the storm, and I knew the roof was going to go and there was no one close enough to help, and I had made sure of that deliberately. I had told everyone to keep their distance." She paused. "And then the roof caved in and you came." Martin said, "I was on the road." She said, "You rode through a storm in the middle of the night and knocked on the door of a woman who had publicly declared she needed no one." He said, "The roof was caved in." She said, "You know what that night was?" He said, "Yes." She said, "What was it?" He said, "The beginning." She said, "Yes." She turned her hand under his so their palms were pressed together, a habit of more than a decade, the familiar weight and warmth of it. She said, "I am glad you came." He said, "I would come again, every time." She said, "I know, and she did know with the deep and settled certainty of a woman who has built her knowing on 10 years of evidence, on a man who had come through a storm when the world was dark and stayed through everything that came after. I would let you. James came in from the yard with his boots dirty, and an expression of complete satisfaction about whatever he had been building, and he wanted to tell them about it, and he did, in the long, detailed way of a 10-year-old who assumes the full attention of his audience. And me and Martin gave it to him, and Clara came in from her book when she smelled supper, and announced that she had decided to become a teacher like Clara Devlin, which me received with a calm that concealed a deep and specific satisfaction. And Martin said, "You would be a very good one," with the certainty of a man who had been watching this daughter operate in the world and had no doubts about it at all. They ate supper at the table that had been the center of the Keene homestead before it was the Granger farm, the table that had held the midnight bread and ham of a storm-soaked emergency night, and the coffee of 100 Thursday evenings, and the careful pencil lines of plans made together. Me had sanded it smooth and refinished it in 1886, and it had been growing good memories ever since. She looked at it sometimes the way she looked at the farm, as a thing that accumulated richness over time, layer on layer of what had happened at it, all of it present in the wood grain if you knew how to look. The summer of 1895 was a good summer, one of the kind that old-timers said the plains owed them after the difficult run of years before. The wheat came in abundantly, and the cattle were healthy, and the laying hens continued their loyal and productive work, and the farm account book showed, for the first time in the years me had been keeping it, a number large enough that she could think about the future in a way that was expansive rather than careful. She bought a second good horse and repaired the barn properly rather than in the patchwork way of seasons where the money had to be directed at more urgent things, and she planted apple trees along the south fence with the patient long-term thinking of a person who knows she is planting for decades. Martin watched her plant the apple trees on a Saturday afternoon in late April with the expression of a man who understands what a thing means. He said, "Those will not fruit for years," she said, 7 or 8. He said, "James will be 17, she said. "Yes," he said, "and Clara 13. She said, "That is right." He said, "You are planting them for then." Me pressed the last small tree into its hole and tamped the earth around it and stood up straight and looked at the row of slender whips with their new buds just beginning and the whole of the south fence running beside them in the afternoon light. She said, "I am planting them for always. The children and whoever comes after them." She looked at Martin. "This is what we are building, not for a season, for always." He looked at her for a long moment with everything in his face that had always been there, the honesty and the steadiness and the particular quality of love that had walked through a storm to a stranger's door and stayed for a lifetime. He said, "Always." She said, "Yes." They walked back to the house in the late afternoon, shoulder to shoulder in the way they walked everywhere now, and the apple trees stood in their row in the Kansas soil, small and sturdy and rooted, reaching their new branches toward a sky that went on longer than you could see. The same extraordinary sky that had been above this piece of earth before there was a farm here and would be above it long after, and underneath it the Granger farm lay complete in the evening light. The fields and the barn and the hens in their yard and the cattle in the south pasture, and the house with its repaired roof, and its good stove and its table full of years. And me Granger stood at her door and looked at all of it with the same full, open, undefended expression she had worn on the morning her son was born, the look of a woman who has stopped managing what she feels because what she feels no longer needs management, only room. She had told the whole town she needed no one, and she had been telling the truth as she understood it then. And then the storm had come, and the roof had caved in, and Martin Granger had been on the road, and he had stopped and knocked, and she had let him in. And it had turned out that the truest thing was not that she needed no one, but that she had needed exactly the right person, and that person had come through the dark on a horse named Duster, and not made anything of it except what it was, a problem and a solution, and the beginning of everything. Martin came up beside her in the doorway. He looked out at the farm and the evening sky. He put his arm around her shoulders the way he had first done it on the road on Christmas Eve 12 years ago, and she leaned into it the way she had leaned then, and the motion of it was as natural as the rise and fall of her own breathing. James called something from the barn. Clara appeared at the edge of the field with a book under her arm and her dark hair loose in the evening breeze. The apple trees stood in their new row. The sky went on and on. Mae Granger said, "This is it." Martin said, "Yes." She said, "This is exactly it." He said, "Yes," and he held her, and the sun went down over the Kansas plains in the long, slow way it did when it was taking its time, burning the whole horizon gold and then amber, and then a deep, settled red that faded to the dark in which the stars came out, one by one, until the whole enormous sky was bright with them, and the Granger farm was quiet and whole beneath it, rooted and real and built to last.